The sun dipped below the horizon as David shuffled through the barn, his footsteps echoing on the empty floor. The air was cool, carrying the scent of hay and recent rain. He set down his tools with a deliberate rhythm, aware that time was marching on. The barn door creaked open, revealing rows of crates and partially unpacked supplies scattered like forgotten chaos. He pushed through, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape outside. The fields around him were alive with fall foliage, golden and vibrant against the pale winter sky. The chickens clucked lazily in their chicken coop, and a rooster cawed at the edge of view as David passed by. He smiled faintly to himself, contentment mixed with a slight unease he hadn't felt in weeks. That evening after work, Grace had called, her voice tinged with something unexpected. "I need to talk to you," she said, her usual calm tone now tinged with something darker. David, always the first to listen, seated on the stoop, his drink untouched but not unnoticing. "She told me about her work," she began hesitantly, her eyes narrowing. "About a project in Paris." David listened as she described it vividly, the details swirling around him like a storm. She mentioned something unexpected, that she had been working on an artist who seemed to evoke strong emotions. Fear. Her face flushed, she added, "James, he's an artist. We met at a conference, but—" Her voice trailed off as if struck by memory or emotion. David felt his heart race, though he tried to keep it steady. James was present now, standing in the living room, his silhouette against the wall. He was older, with sharp features and piercing eyes. His hair was silvery gray, adding an air of mystery. He looked up when Grace approached, his expression unreadable but clearly focused on her. David watched this exchange silently, a storm brewing inside that he couldn't yet name. The barn door creaked again as Jessica appeared at the far end of the room, holding a small notebook and a pen. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, and she spoke in monotone sentences, each word a struggle. "Jessica," Grace began, stopping herself mid-sentence, "I told you about my project. James is working on it too." There was a pause, then a quick nod of understanding from James as he approached her. David felt his breath catch. Jessica's eyes widened when she saw him approach, and she turned to look at him carefully. Her gaze was steady but intense, and for a moment David wondered if she saw something he didn't say. The barn door closed with a soft click. Grace resumed her story, her voice now heavy. "James said he'd use my project as inspiration. He's been talking about it nonstop." David's mind raced. He had seen enough in his years as a doctor to know when someone was lying, but Grace, could she be hiding something? Or worse? Jessica placed the notebook down and left the room, leaving David to ponder her presence alone at the far corner of the room. The barn door creaked again, and he turned his attention back to Grace. "She's been avoiding me," she said finally, her voice dropping in tone. "Why?" David's heart pounded as he considered her words. He knew better than to ask too many questions. He was an attentive husband, but not one to push unwarranted accusations. Yet something inside him whispered that she might be hiding more than she was letting on. That night, as the stars twinkled overhead, David sat by the fire, a fire that had been lit long ago. He felt a cold dread settled in his gut, a shadow that threatened to consume him if he weren't careful. The next chapter would bring more revelations and questions, but for now, all he knew was that something was very wrong and very dangerous. Jessica's notebook lay untouched on the table as David closed the book. He picked it up, curiosity piqued by its presence. Inside, he found a series of entries, each one more cryptic than the last. The first page was blank, but then— "Her art." The barn door creaked softly again as David settled himself on the stoop, a sense of impending storm building within him. The sky was a deepening gray, and the stars above seemed unusually distant. Grace had called that evening with an urgency he hadn't felt in weeks, her voice tinged with something he couldn't name, a warning that sent chills racing down his spine. "David," she began, her eyes narrowing as if to demand an immediate response. Her gaze was steady but piercing, and David could feel the heat of her emotion rise to his cheeks. "James is working on my project." James's silhouette against the wall spoke volumes. His face was shadows, sharp yet enigmatic, with silvery gray hair that seemed to glow in the dim light. He turned towards Grace as she approached, his expression unreadable but filled with a quiet intensity. Their eyes met briefly, and David felt his heart leap, a connection he couldn't quite define. David's mind raced as Jessica appeared at the far end of the room, holding a notebook and a pen. Her face was pale, her gaze distant, and she spoke in monotone sentences that made little sense to him. She placed the notebook down and left the room, leaving David alone with Grace and Jessica, their eyes locked in a silent exchange. By the time he reached the barn door, his heart was hammering against his ribs. The door creaked again as he entered, the familiar scent of hay mingling with the faint earthiness of recent rain. The field outside was alive with fall foliage, the golden leaves rustling softly in the fading light. A rooster lazily clucked at the edge of view, and a lone crow hooted somewhere to the north. But David's gaze was fixed on Grace, his attention trained like a hawk. She had avoided him since their conversation that fateful evening, her eyes distant but filled with an unease he couldn't quite place. He suspected there was more to her project than she was letting on, perhaps something deeper, something that threatened to unravel the fragile peace they shared. As he sat by the fire, a cold dread settled in his gut, a gnawing feeling that gnawed at him from within. The stars twinkled overhead, but they didn't comfort him. Something was very wrong, and it was very dangerous. David knew that the next chapter would bring more revelations, and perhaps even more questions. Until then, all he could do was stay vigilant. Jessica's notebook lay untouched on the table as he closed it. He picked it up, curiosity piqued by its presence. Inside, he found a series of entries, each one more cryptic than the last. The first page was blank, but then, "The artist is not who she seems." The barn door creaked softly as David sat on the stoop, gazing out over the field. The golden leaves rustled beneath his feet like silken petals, and the faint sound of a crow hooting somewhere to the north filled the air. He had expected Grace's return every evening since their fateful encounter last week, but this time she was gone again. He pushed open the barn door with cautious precision, the cold night air biting through. The familiar scent of hay and recent rain filled the air, mingling with the faint traces of earthiness from days spent in the fields. A rooster lazily clucked at the edge of view as David made his way toward the barn. He stopped short when he heard a faint knock at the door. Jessica's voice, a monotone, almost musical quality to it, came through. "David," she called out, her expression unreadable but filled with an intensity that sent chills racing down his spine. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest as he considered whether to answer. Then, without a second thought, he opened the door. Jessica stood there, her silhouette against the wall etched with shadows, silvery gray hair cascading over her shoulders like nightfall's longest twilight, and sharp features that were both enigmatic and haunting. Her eyes were distant, but for all intents and purposes, they locked onto his as if reading his soul. He could feel her gaze draining away at him, but she did not move. "James," she called out, her voice steady yet filled with something akin to desperation. David's heart leaped, a connection he couldn't quite name, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment there was nothing between them. No fear, no doubt, just an unspoken understanding that spanned miles. "James is working on my project," she said finally, her voice dropping in tone. David's mind raced as Jessica spoke, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to process the gravity of what she had just revealed. James, of all people, was working on her project, but it was worse than that. It was far more dangerous. David's eyes narrowed behind his glasses, and he turned to leave before she could say more, but Jessica held out a hand in protest. Her expression was calm but firm, and for a moment David felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy shroud. "I don't want you to get hurt," she said softly, her voice carrying a tone of desperation he couldn't ignore. She stepped aside, her notebook at her side, as if to shield herself from whatever was about to happen. But David knew better than to argue. He stood his ground, his expression unreadable but filled with an intensity that sent chills racing down his spine. He had faced more dangerous enemies in his years as a doctor, and this was nothing compared to what Grace had been through. Jessica's eyes closed briefly, as if trying to process the information she had just revealed. Then, with a sudden, almost imperceptible movement, she turned and left the barn, her silhouette against the wall etched with shadows that seemed to follow her every step. David stood alone in the silence, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. The barn door creaked softly again as Grace entered, her usual calm demeanor now tinged with something darker. Her eyes narrowed behind her glasses, and she met David's gaze with a fierce intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "What is it?" she said finally, her voice dropping in tone once more. David's mind raced as he considered what Grace might have discovered this time. What could James possibly know about her project? It was impossible to imagine the depths of what they shared, but David knew there was no time for him to dwell on the possibilities. He needed to find Jessica and protect her, not from anything she had done, but because she was connected to something far more dangerous, and he would do whatever it took to ensure that she remained safe. As he turned and left the barn, David knew that this night was going to be far from peaceful. The tension between him and Grace was palpable, and he could feel the weight of her secret pressing against him like an invisible chain. He also knew that Jessica's notebook was not the only thing she had brought with her. There was something far more sinister at play, something that would soon put them all at risk. David sat alone in the living room as Jessica's notebook lay untouched on the table. Inside were a series of entries, each one more cryptic than the last. The first page was blank, but then, "The artist is not who she seems." The barn door creaked softly as David exited the barn, his heart pounding with a mix of guilt and resolve. Grace was waiting at the entrance, her usual calm demeanor replaced by an intensity that sent chills down his spine. "David," she began abruptly, her voice carrying a tone of desperation, "James is working on your project." David's mind raced as he approached her. He knew what this meant, another layer of complexity to unravel in their fragile partnership. He couldn't let them both get caught up in Jessica's twisted plan. He needed to act decisively. Jessica stood nearby, her presence an enigma wrapped in silence. The notebook on the table lay untouched, its pages filled with cryptic entries that whispered warnings, hinting at a deeper conspiracy. "Grace," David said, his voice steady but firm, "James is involved. Jessica knows more than she's letting on." Grace turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Her gaze was cold and unyielding as she lowered her voice. "You have no choice, David." David hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. He reached out and took her hand, his touch tentative yet genuine. "I know what you're doing is wrong," he admitted softly. The tension between them was palpable. Grace's grip tightened around his hand as tears welled in her eyes. She looked away briefly, her voice rising above the sound of distant crows. "This isn't about us." David's heart ached with the weight of their conflict. He couldn't let Jessica suffer any more than she already had. "Jessica is my responsibility," he said honestly. "I can't let her fall into something she can't handle." Grace's expression softened, but it didn't ease his resolve. She nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "You know what to do." David nodded, the weight of their secret pressing against him as they walked toward the barn door together. Inside, Jessica waited in shadows, her notebook still intact, a silent companion in their fragile partnership. As they set the barn door clicks closed behind them, David felt a surge of regret and duty mixed within him. The betrayal was real, and he had no choice but to navigate this storm on his own. He turned away from Grace, leaving her with the burden of protecting Jessica while he faced the consequences. Jessica's notebook lay untouched on the table as they exited the barn. David couldn't ignore the cryptic words it contained, words that whispered of a darkness far more dangerous than any daylight foe. In the silence that followed, David knew he had to make a choice, one that would test his heart and define his legacy. The tension between them was unbreakable. Their path lay ahead filled with peril and heartache. And so, as they walked into the evening air together, David carried Jessica's weight on his shoulders, a decision he would have to make in the darkness of the night when the stars no longer shone brightly.